It is often said that nonverbal communication accounts from anywhere from 60 to even 90% of overall communication. And so we can see that when we talk about communication, we often think about verbal communication, but nonverbal communication encompasses a much larger amount of territory. And so today we'll be talking about nonverbal communication. The definition of nonverbal communication also indicates the importance of linguistic or symbolic or verbal communication. So, nonverbal communication is any form of communication that is outside of symbolic or linguistic systems. Our bodies do not only communicate to others, and so our bodies are rhetorical, our facial expressions are rhetorical, our gestures communicate messages. And so that much is obviously is known oftentimes and is somewhat obvious. But what is not as obvious is that our bodies are also epistemic, and so that we learn from our bodies. And so the gestures that we take and the postures that we assume not only inform others about ways to behave and communicate messages in the traditional sense of communicating a message, but they are also epistemic. And so, epistemology, how we know what we know things and we know the meaning of concepts from performing them through actions and through acting them out. And so, in this regard, our bodies are epistemic and we're constantly learning from our bodies. If you want to feel confident, it is often stated to stand in the super person stance. And if you do that, you will not only project an air of confidence, they say, and so you might do that in a public presentation, stand upright and project confidence through your bodily gestures. But it's also recommended now that we do that before we speak. And so behind the scenes, backstage, assume that position of confidence in the super person stance, and then walk out and deliver your speech or your presentation as you normally would. And so standing in that posture behind the scenes teaches us to be confident and we learn from it. And so how we know what we know, our bodies are epistemic. We remember things in our bodies that our minds forget. And so we learn through gestures. And so tying our shoes, that simple task way back when we learn to tie our shoes, still sits with us. Now, if I try to tell you how to tie your shoes conceptually, I might get mixed up. You tie a bow and then you tie another bow. Sometimes those are called rabbit ears. Sometimes these are mnemonic devices that we use to remember how to physically do something. Two rabbit ears cross over, uh, so on and so forth. But when I bend down to tie my shoes, it happens quite naturally. And so I'm bypassing that conceptual process in my mind, and my body knows what my mind really can't articulate at that moment. If we've ever forgotten a code or a passcode for the numerous codes that we might need these days, we might forget and try to think in our head, what is my code again? What is my code? Take a break, turn to the side, uh, move away from your keyboard, and then just come back to your keyboard and type it out with your hands. Oftentimes, you will remember it, or your body will remember it as your body goes through those motions and you achieve the correct passcode that your body knew at that point, but your mind forgot. And so, it's not to, we shouldn't forget the rhetorical aspect is primarily what we'll talk about here as we talk about nonverbal elements. And so, in that, our nonverbal gestures and posturing influence others, they are rhetorical. And so, they have an impact on others. And so, others read into our actions and gestures a series of messages. And so if one yawns, during a conversation, you might assume that that person is bored with what you're saying or disinterested or not listening. In actuality, that person might just be tired. um, they might be hungry, and they might just have a reflex to yawn. Oftentimes, the people talk about yawning being contagious, or pulling out our cell phones is contagious. One person does it, then somebody else does it. We're not actually feeling like we want to yawn or that we want to look at our phone on our own, but because somebody else has done that, it communicates that message to us, and then we might do something similar. We talked about this with mirroring. It's just a natural inclination, I believe. But it is also rhetorical. It influences others. It's hard not to react if someone is yawning repeatedly during a conversation. And so you might not want it to mean something, but it almost always does communicate something to somebody else. And so we're usually aware of these nonverbal messages. And when we're talking to somebody, we oftentimes provide feedback, positive feedback. We nod our head. We sit back and cross our arms when there's an interesting statement. We lean in when it's something juicy. Uh, and we try not to yawn, look outside the window, or the classic looking at your watch. We look at our watch and our phones for so many reasons these days, but that age old sentiment that if I'm looking at my watch or my phone, I'm thinking that we need to cut things short and I have somewhere else to be. And so these are one of my favorite aspects of communication studies and foundational nonverbal communication studies, and that's codes: kinesics, proxemics, haptics, chronemics, artifacts, paralanguage, personal appearance, and also facial expressions. And so we'll talk about these elements of nonverbal communication here. Kinesics. I encourage you to think about society. I encourage you to think about you and your close network of friends and family. I also encourage you to think about specific cultural iterations where kinesics or bodily movement is used to communicate certain messages. Here's an example of breakdancing or breaking in hip hop culture, one of the four elements of hip hop culture. And so this one is almost entirely nonverbal and it deals with bodily movement, but it communicates something: the competitiveness, the individuality, the creativeness, the aggressiveness of breakdancing is communicated through kinesic forms of communication. And the messages contained in these nonverbal actions reflect the values of hip hop culture: individual creativity, competition, aggressiveness, and breaking down barriers through unique and interesting messages. In this case, messages that are performed by the body moving in rhythms with time, space, and music. And so think about what ballet might communicate versus what salsa dancing might communicate versus what breakdancing might communicate. Just if we were to just watch a performance of each type of dance, different messages and values would be communicated. Proxemics, space. Now, space is always a part of any communication interaction. If you are in the presence of somebody, you're in a large auditorium, then clearly that space will influence the communication interaction. If you're all the way across the room and I yell something to you, this becomes public communication. I will most likely not communicate something personal in that instance. Now, if I walk closer, the closer to you I walk, the more personal the messages get. And if I'm really close and I'm whispering something, then it's probably something very personal, and we most likely have a history or a close interpersonal relationship. And so all the while, that proxemics, that space is used to communicate and influences the message. If we are dealing with a culture or an interaction that happens via email or text message or social media, and people are detached from that presence on that physical space, that also influences the nature of the message and even what the message means. And so if I said one thing in text versus one thing in email versus one thing face to face communication, you might not even think it was the same message, right? The message would change. I'm thinking about Marshall McLuhan's idea of the message is the medium, or the medium is the message here. The medium plays such a large part in understanding the message. And so proxemics and how it's used to communicate. Nonverbal communication, we can look at these two individuals here and know that something is going on. There's facial expression, there's kinesics, bodily posturing and gesturing, and there's also that space, which they're sitting on the same couch, is actually pretty close to each other, but it seems to be indicative of the state of the relationship at that moment. And so space and its use to communicate. We communicate in various ways. Touch, touch and its use to communicate, or haptics. And so when you shake someone's hand versus waving at them from afar versus hugging them close. When you're walking with somebody, you might have a small distance. And the closer the distance, proxemics, usually the closer the relationship. And then if you're touching, you've broken that touch barrier. And we don't always know what is communicated. Just like when we speak words and use symbols within a symbolic system, we don't know exactly what these words communicate, but we know that they communicate something. And we know that there's often times an intention behind these forms of communication. We oftentimes think that nonverbal communication is more authentic, and it is harder to deceive in face-to-face situations than it is via email, phone, or text message, because we have all of these nonverbal cues to go off of. Does this person mean what they are saying at this moment? And the reason for that goes back to that original statement, that there's just a much larger territory of nonverbal communication than there is for verbal communication. And so breaking that touch barrier, we don't know what that handshake or that hug or that lighthearted pat or slap on the back or the shoulder means. We just know that a barrier has been broken, and now we're talking about haptic communication, and something has been communicated. Chronemics. How many people remember their first watch, or now their first phone, or their first clock, or anything that told the time? We oftentimes think fondly about our first watch or our first time-telling device. And the reason for that is because children aren't really on the same page as society. They can't really walk up to an adult and have a casual conversation. Hey, how's it going today, adult person? Fine weather we're having. And so we're not really on the same page when we are young and children as the rest of society. But when we get that watch and when we get that time-telling device, all of a sudden we speak a very similar language. We know literally what time it is. And so some adult can walk up to a small child and say, excuse me, do you know the time? And that small child could look at their watch and tell time accurately and actually have information that other people care about. So it's one of the first things that we learn, one of the first languages that we are privy to, and one of the ways we enter in to adult worlds. We become a little older, and that's one of the things we talk about as an attribute for getting a job. I am punctual. I arrive on time, which communicates honesty and reliability and maturity because you recognize the importance not only of your time, but of everybody else's time. And so, chronemics, time, and its use to communicate. How long do we look at our phones? How long do we talk on our phones to other people? What time do we choose to call somebody or hang out with somebody? These are all elements of chronemics, how we use time to communicate. If I was on the phone last night with somebody for an hour and a half, no matter what we were talking about, it shows that there was some sort of connection there, just based on the time that we spent together talking. And so you can look at the time, much like the medium and the space, and note that it speaks about the message and even indicates the nature of the message. So, chronemics, how else do you and your friends use time? How else does a specific cultural iteration consider time? And how do we think about time in society? Almost every public square, plaza, almost every university has a clock tower or a large clock that is public. And so it just shows how important time is to our society. Watches. We almost most of us have phones. We don't really need watches as much as we used to tell time, but they're still around, and so they seem to be around for more than their capacity to tell time. And so, a Rolex or an expensive luxury item watch speaks volumes about not just someone's ability to tell time or desire to tell time, but their identity and their status and their place within society because it's an artifact and it's an object that we adorn ourselves with and we use to communicate. It's also very public. And so most people can see it. And so a briefcase, a tie, a suit, clothing, headphones, all of these are objects that we adorn ourselves with, and they are used in various ways to communicate. Now, once again, we don't exactly know what they communicate at any given instance, but we do know that they communicate something. Paralanguage. And so it's often said that it's not necessarily what we say, but how we say it. And so you can say the same thing in two different ways. And each of those instances can mean something entirely different. Yes, I really like that movie. Yeah, I really like that movie. And so you can see that the first one, I probably authentically enjoyed the movie. The second one, I was being sarcastic or ironic or snarky or cynical, and I don't, in fact, like the movie. And so you can see how the way we say something is entirely different. And so rate, pitch, volume, inflection, silence, and tone, and a host of other ways of speaking all indicate the nature of the message. And so, how we say what we say, I encourage you to think about a statement that you can say the same words, but in two different ways to mean something entirely different. And so that inflection, what words and phrases and syllables do we choose to emphasize? How loud are we speaking? How fast are we speaking? What is my pitch? Oftentimes, when we ask questions, our pitch goes up at the end. Uh, and so, also silence. As I pause there, silence speaks volumes and can be very powerful, especially when we are talking a lot and we live in a society that emphasizes and celebrates talking and kind of almost demonizes silence. But silence can be very effective. And so when we're speaking, we might think about pausing, speaking slower, and waiting to deliver our next thought. The longer we wait before the next word comes, the more important that word. It's pretty interesting because life is all about balance. You see, balance, and no matter what I would have said after that pause, I would have had gravitas. You would have listened to it and thought that it was more important because I waited and I paused and I set it up. And so silence really says a lot. The silent treatment is something. And if you've ever given the silent treatment, or you've ever received the silent treatment, or you've ever anticipated the silent treatment and it wasn't really a silent treatment, you can see how powerful that is. When we thought about chronemics, you might look at your phone and wait for a text message or an email reply. And as that time goes on, now you start thinking and you start filling in the gaps of that silence. Did I say something wrong? Did I phrase this question inaccurately? Was I rude? Are we still friends? Right? And as that time goes on, you keep communicating to yourself, and those messages get stronger and stronger and more powerful. Really, this is just intrapersonal communication, you communicating to yourself. Remember from the lecture series early on, we cannot not communicate. And so if you're in a relationship with somebody, you cannot not communicate. And that silence and how much silence communicates is indicative of that rule in interpersonal communication. Facial expressions. Small movements of face to communicate. Now, a sociologist, an anthropologist, Dr. Ekman, I believe, came up with a few universal facial expressions, and he traveled all over the world and saw that almost everybody from multiple cultures from all around the world have very similar facial expressions: sadness, anger, contempt, disgust, fear, surprise, and happiness. Now, he broke these down to a few emotions that most of us can relate to. And so I might ask you, are these universal? Are these really universal human traits? Or are they more culturally informed? I think either way, we can see that cultural and that social construction aspect here. That even if humans tend to exhibit very similar facial expressions that we tie to emotions now, there's very different cultural assumptions according to that we attach to sadness or happiness or fear or surprise or even showing emotion versus being stoic in general. And so facial expressions, small movements of the face to communicate. We do this all the time as we are listening and attempting to provide feedback to somebody without interrupting them. And so think about this next time you are being a good audience member. So lastly, we'll end nonverbal communication here with physical appearance, physical characteristics, and communication. Now, physical appearance used to be things that we thought of as indelible. We were just born looking a certain way, and we could not really change these elements. And so Nowadays, we really think about the malleability of identity. And identity is really a spectrum. As we grow up and we enter into different professional spheres and cultural spheres and different friend groups, and live different lifestyles, we definitely change our physical appearance. And so, physical appearance is something that communicates a bevy of messages. And it's something that is not static as well. It changes concurrently along with our identities and the messages that appearance communicates. The Rock, for example, was not born The Rock. Right? The Rock becomes The Rock through living a certain lifestyle and engaging in certain activities. Today, he is the highest paid actor in Hollywood, mostly because of his physical appearance. And if you want to get another actor, but you had The Rock in mind, it's going to be very difficult to go out there and find somebody that can fulfill the same role because of his physical appearance. And so this has been another lecture on communication, more specifically, nonverbal communication. Thank you.